About to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Good evening, everybody. It's John here from Tutor to You, welcoming you to another live stream session. Tonight we're back with our usual 5:30 Tuesday A-level geography session, and we're going to be discussing the governance of Antarctica. Massive welcome to those of you who are joining us live. I'm just looking at my little clock down here telling me that there's quite a few people here with us live. Welcome to you. We're obviously going to be delivering some content and some activities relating to the governance of Antarctica, and we would love you to get involved. We would really enjoy it if you would tell us your thoughts about the questions that we're asking, and the chat window is there for you in YouTube to do just that. If you're watching this on replay, on catch up, welcome to you as well, and we're hoping you're going to enjoy this just as much. And of course you can pause the video as you go along and take a little bit longer over the questions. Fortunately for you, I'm not alone tonight because I don't know too much about the governance of the Antarctica, but I'm joined. In the middle of the screen, we've got Abdurrahman there, and we've got Alice. Good evening, both. How are we?
Hi, good.
Good evening. Hi, everyone.
Good to see you both. Good to see you both. Excuse me, a little frog in my throat there. Abdurrahman, can you just give us a few pointers to what we're going to look at tonight?
Yeah, sure. So we're focusing on one of the sort of case studies of global systems and global governance, namely Antarctica as a global common. We're going to, first of all, touch upon the sort of physical geography of Antarctica as a quick reminder, then look at the threats facing Antarctica, but most importantly, focus in on the governance efforts at protecting and enhancing the protection of Antarctica.
Right, brilliant. Excellent stuff. Shall we get started then?
Yeah, let's get cracking. Okay, so we're going to start with a little activity for you at home. It's called Kim's Game. You have 1 minute 30 to memorize the 6 threats to Antarctica, which you need to know about. They're going to all appear on the screen. Try not to write them down and just use your brain power. Can you memorize these 6 threats? Hopefully, mostly they are familiar. Let's have a look then, John. Okay, so I'm not going to talk over the whole thing, but we have rising temperatures, we have the search for mineral resources, we have tourism, fishing and whaling, changes to ocean salinity, and scientific research. All 6 are threats to Antarctica that we need to know about, but can you remember all of them? Look carefully because they'll start to disappear. Now, rising temperatures, of course, very topical. We just had COP26, all linked to human-enhanced climate change. Search for mineral resources. Well, of course, all of the Earth continents have got valuable resources, but it's quite controversial whether they should be exploited in Antarctica. Okay, let's have a think about which item is missing. So we've got we've got 5 threats with the 6th missing. If you think you know which threat is missing from the screen, type it in the chat window and we'll let you know if you are correct. Have a go. Okay. I can see people having a bit of a go. Some people have been paying attention. We've got changes to ocean salinity, tourism, scientific research, fishing and whaling, the search for mineral resources. What's missing, John? Rising temperatures. Okay, so very, very topical stuff. I would imagine most people have that right if you're playing at home. So I'm going to hand back to Abdurrahman to give us the context for this.
Thanks, Alice. Antarctica, as Alice has just mentioned, it's a very topical issue at the moment. It's governance, namely because the IPCC's latest report, which was released in August 2021, so just before this academic year began, it outlined the most up-to-date physical understanding of the climate system and climate change, and Antarctica was mentioned 400 times in it, so really showing the relevance of the continent as a fragile environment. Let's have the next slide. Yeah, this is a map of the Antarctic region, which you should all be familiar with because you need to know about the physical geography of Antarctica. So Antarctica is a global common, as I'm sure you all know, and as with most global commons, it is vulnerable to economic pressures and environmental change, but especially vulnerable, being a global common, because it lies outside of the domain of any country and is not owned by any country, and that's what makes its governance really tricky, as we will come to see in this session. So what is global governance, this thing that I've mentioned a few times? Essentially, it's a movement of political integration aimed at negotiating responses to problems that affect more than one state or region. The idea is that because global commons are no one's, then they are everyone's to protect. And as with global governance, you may have looked at, for example, the global governance of climate, as illustrated by COP26, and perhaps the less than ideal outcomes of it that you may have picked up in the news, or the global governance of health issues, for example, COVID-19, but before that, Ebola, etc. There are many issues involved in the developing governance of Antarctica. It really is not straightforward at all. But who is involved, or what is involved, and what do we need to know about? Well, the UN the UNEP, the IWC, any signatories to the Antarctic Treaty from 1959, the Madrid Protocol from 91, the Whaling Moratorium from 1982, and then also NGOs, non-governmental organizations such as ASOC and the WWF. Okay, so what else do we need to know in relation to the development governance of Antarctica? What I suggest you do, either if you're watching now or certainly if you're watching on replay, is perhaps pause the video at certain points and feel free to take note. There's going to be some things that you already know that I cover, but also some content that I'm going to cover as well. So feel free to pause, perhaps take screenshots of the screen to add to your notes. But yeah, so we need to look at three things. Firstly, the purpose. So what do they do? Why do they exist? Why do certain organizations exist? Why do certain treaties exist? And what do they do, right? What's the point of them? The second thing we need to look at is their scope, right? What is their remit? What do they operate on? Where do they operate? And this time we're thinking really about spatial scale as well, right? So across what scale do they work? And then finally, systems for inspection and enforcement. And this is perhaps the most important thing when we're talking about global governance. One of the greatest drawbacks of global governance is the fact that some organizations seem to be all bark and no bite. So we need to think about what systems do they have for inspection, how do they watch over, and what do they do to those who transgress? What do they do to those who break the rule? Okay, right. I believe we now have a game. Over to you, Alice.
Thank you. Okay, so what we've got here is a code we need to crack. Can you put these events, so we've got 6 events there linked to letters, capital letters, can you put these major events in the history of Antarctica's governance in order from earliest, so which took place first, to the latest or the most recent event? So it's your second opportunity to take part in the chat window. And what you need to do is put a 6-letter code into the chat window. So if you think, for example, B, the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary, is the earliest event here, then you would start your code with B. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of time to have a think about that. Let's have a read through them. And then I'm looking for a 6-letter code in the chat window, putting the earliest event first. Yeah, now John's obviously struggling and he's thinking he might like a clue. So I'm going to give you a clue. I'm going to tell you that your code is not going to start with B. Okay, so the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary is not the first event or protocol in our list of 6, if we're thinking about when they happened. Okay, and if you're playing at home, of course, you can pause the video. I can see people scratching their heads, sucking the end of their pen, and some of them typing. Brilliant, thank you for having a go. Okay, great. And John, can we have the reveal on this one, please? Thank you. Okay, so in order, thinking about the earliest event there, D, your code should begin with D because the Antarctic Treaty, of course, was from 1959. Then we have F, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. This was a point at which the Antarctic Treaty System developed further, particularly around concern for marine life and particularly krill, which of course form the basis of the Antarctic food web. E is the next event, the moratorium on commercial whaling, and that would be something that was agreed in 1982 and enforced in 1986. Sorry, the formation of CAMLA was 1982. Then we have A, which is the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. A bit of a mouthful, that one. You probably know it as the Madrid Protocol. The Madrid Protocol, signed in 1991. Then we have the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary, which came into force just a little bit later, came into force in 1994, protecting the ocean surrounding the continent of Antarctica from all types of commercial whaling. And then last but not least, we have the formation of the Marine Protected Area in the Ross Sea, which perhaps arguably is more like a marine park because it wasn't fully recognised as a marine protected area. But that came about in 2016. Okay, thank you. So what threatens Antarctica? We've talked about these a little bit already. We've got climate change, we have fishing and whaling, the search for mineral resources, and tourism and scientific research. These are how these threats are grouped together, thinking about the AQA, A-level spec, and we can see they're all threatening this physical environment, this kind of one of the world's last wildernesses, arguably, in different ways. Specifically, if we think about tourism, up to 50,000 visitors a year now. So one of the things you're going to need to think about is which of these threats are more pressing or more dangerous for the environment. And if I could have the next slide, please. So if we pick two, if we think about tourism versus fishing and whaling, I suppose it's thinking about three. Start thinking about what you've done in class and what you know about these. Which do you think is the bigger threat to Antarctica? And we're going to be focusing in on these three today and giving you a bit more detail about them so you can think about actually weighing them up ultimately towards the end. Okay, Abdurrahman, I think, is going to talk a little bit about fishing to start with.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Like I said before, this is some stuff that I'm going to talk through, which might be new to you. So perhaps taking notes on this or looking at it later when you're making some revision materials would be a good idea. Perhaps mostly because a lot of this stuff is quite up to date. So it'd be really, really impressive in a 20 mark or another question in the exam. So as some of you may know, IUU fishing refers to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And although fishing and whaling is probably the most tightly monitored threat to Antarctica when you take into account others like climate change, there are still problems and illegal fishing is still happening. CCAMLR, otherwise known as the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, it's part of the ATS, the Antarctic Treaty System, and it's got a list, right? It's called the CP IUU vessel list, and it's a list of ships which have been reported to be undermining their conservation objectives. And the way it works is that countries that are part of CCAMLR are allowed to essentially recommend certain ships to be part of the list, right? But the problem is enforcement, or really the lack thereof, which I'll explain in a second in a sort of short story. What does the CCAMLR do after a report? Well, essentially it adds the ship to the list, which is a little bit like a slap on the wrist. And then it encourages the country to which the ship belongs. Let's say it's a Dutch flagged ship or a Russian flagged ship. It encourages it to investigate the activities of the vessel. It leaves it down to the nation themselves to do the punishing and to do the enforcing. It itself can do nothing but that. So let's have a look at this in relation to a story that happened not too long ago. So this is the case of the Palmer. A Palmer is a Russian flagged vessel, so it's a ship that comes out of Russia. New Zealand was the first to report this vessel, and it recommended it that it was placed on the CP IUU list. Essentially, it had, or claimed rather, New Zealand, because you'll see at the end this is still an allegation. New Zealand claimed that they had been fishing where they weren't supposed to be fishing near Antarctica. New Zealand also accused the ship, and this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting, almost like a Hollywood film. It accused the ship of falsifying its VMS data. VMS data is basically satellite tracking on ships, sort of like GPS for a car, because it said that it was actually 800 nautical miles away from where the ship claimed to be. So the ship claimed to be somewhere, but apparently, according to New Zealand satellite images, it was 800 miles away doing something it shouldn't be doing. New Zealand also accused Russia of not attending to its obligations to provide further information. and the US and the EU backed New Zealand's recommendation to put it on the list. However, the CCAMLR did not reach a consensus on including the Palmer on the list and therefore did not do it. It's a little bit of an insight also into unequal power relations. Earlier on in that meeting where they decided not to put Palmer on the list, they had decided to put a ship from Panama really, really easily. Someone recommended for the ship from Panama to be put on the list. Panama themselves said that was fine, and the ship was placed on the ship. However, when it came to a Russian flagship, and obviously we know the influence Russia has in geopolitics, it was much harder to do. So there's a lot to read into that. So that was just the story of the Palmer there for you. But like I was saying earlier, this is a developing story. So most recently, earlier this year, from the 14th to the 24th of June, France was the host state for the 43rd Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. And it was also, at the same time, the 23rd meeting of the Committee for Environmental Protection. Over 450 participants attended, featuring parties, experts, NGOs, international observers, and they did some good work. The ATCM adopted the Paris Declaration, coming out of obviously COP21 in 2015, and adopted a resolution which reaffirms the need to consider the implications of climate change on the management of human activities in Antarctica. So let's see how you fare in this next game of Big Reveal.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we have a big reveal here. We're going to get 5 different clues about something that we have been talking about that was an event, shall we say, in the its creation was an event in the developing governance of Antarctica. So John, if we can have the first clue, and if you spot it on the first clue, go ahead and write it up in the chat window, because I'd love to see people who can guess it early on. Okay, so maybe this doesn't give it away. It was established in 1946. So think about something that might be linked to Antarctica, established early on. I think we might need to go for the second clue. John, please. Okay, it has substantial practical limitations on its authority. So we've been hearing about governance and particular bodies involved in governance that perhaps can't go as far as they'd like in enforcing kind of agreements. Okay, people still a bit stumped here, John. Give us a third clue. Okay, it has no ability to enforce any of its decisions through penalty imposition. And I guess this is often the difference between governance and government. We're actually looking at something that can't be enforced directly, but it's about creating norms and agreements that the countries feel sort of compelled to follow. Okay, let's have the fourth clue then. It was responsible for a moratorium on whaling in 1982. So that international moratorium on whaling, signed in 1982, came in force in 1986. Who did that? Okay, some people having a bit of a guess. I think some people know the answer to this one. Fifth clue, please. It has helped to shift attitudes towards whaling on a planetary scale, influencing norms. So what we're talking about with norms. Okay, I think it's got quite easy now, John. Let's go for the reveal. So it's the International Whaling Commission, and well done to the people that got that. Okay, next big reveal then, please. So again, thinking about a body involved in governance, it has a polar task force. A polar task force. Oh, we're not sure yet. Can we have the second clue for this one, please? Okay, something that was founded in 1972, so quite early on in terms of a regulatory body or international government body. Now let's go for the third clue then, please. Its personnel participate in ongoing Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. Okay, so it's actually taking part in those meetings. And the next clue, please. It is heavily involved in Arctic governance too. Okay, so I guess we could have worked that out from it has a polar task force. So perhaps working at both poles. I think some people might know what we're talking about now. But let's have the last clue then. It is a branch of the UN, and I guess that gives it away. So let's have the reveal. It's, of course, the United Nations Environment Programme. Thank you. Right, let's have that last big reveal exercise then. Okay, so first clue is it banned mining on the continent. And I can see what you're thinking with those guesses, but let's get a bit more detail because we might be getting some incorrect answers there. It is enforced strictly under international law. Okay, so that's an interesting point. So it is enforced strictly under international law. Let's have the next clue then, please. Has been ratified by 34 parties, so 34 different countries have ratified it, backed it. Okay, and let's have the next clue, please. It was signed in 1991 in Madrid. So if you were listening earlier, you know what the answer is now. But let's have the last clue. It's up for review in 2048, at which time it may change. Okay, well done to the people taking part. What's the answer then? The Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, which, as most of us know it as the Madrid Protocol, as the pithy way to remember it, 1991, really involved in protecting Antarctica, particularly on the conservation front, but specifically linked to limiting mining. Okay, back to Abdurrahman.
Great, thanks, Alice. What's important to remember when we look at all of the threats to Antarctica is that although things like fishing might seem insignificant in relation to climate change, and so too with tourism, as we've already proved with that earlier story, fishing is still definitely a problem for Antarctica. It's arguably not being managed efficiently enough, and so too with tourism. There are gaps in everything, and certainly if it's listed on the spec as a threat, then it is actually genuinely a threat and we need to consider it. Yes, one might argue that climate change is the largest threat, if that is your opinion, but certainly tourism does provide a threat as well. One of the rules for tourism within Antarctica is keep Antarctica pristine, leave no trace of your visit. And there are very stringent rules in place in a very lengthy ATCM site guidelines for visitors. In fact, parties to the Antarctic Treaty are asked to modernize their national legislation to ensure the implementation of the ATS regulatory framework by tourist operators. So essentially, that is the global scale working with the national in global governance, which obviously we're asked to do in the AQA spec and consider how the international works with the national example of that. But again, it's left up to the treaties, to the parties, to do that themselves. Right? So if one country decides to do it and to force its tourist operators to do something, the other country might not choose to do the same. Right? So it really is left to choice and to norms, as Alice mentioned earlier, and norms by their very definition are not compulsory to follow. There's also a framework for parties to use if they wish to monitor tourism. But like I said, again, this is all voluntary. No one has to keep an eye on each other. You might choose to in a very sort of lengthy document to fill in. But again, there's a choice for this. We also need to, if we move on to the next one, manage scientific research. Again, one of the threats listed on the specification. It's a very popular activity. There's no two ways about it. Antarctica is a pristine environment, it's a fragile environment, and it's a unique environment in many ways. So, of course, scientists are attracted to it. The Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, otherwise known as SCAR, is the main body that regulates this. There is a very long SCAR code of conduct which provides guidance when planning, for example, field research by scientists and other people in the Antarctic Treaty area. And like I said, it's very lengthy and very particular, even stipulating things like that fossils found in one area should not be moved in the other in order to protect what they say is the scientific integrity of a location. Okay, I think it's back to you, Alice, with another game.
Thank you. I feel like I'm just doing the fun stuff today, a bit sort of Carol Vorderman or something. Right, picture grid. We've got a picture hidden behind the grid here, which is going to be revealed question by question, and we have 6 questions here. So if you think you know the answer to each of the questions, do put it in the chat, but also do tell me if you think you know what the picture is. So John, if we could have the first question, please. Okay, 52 nations are now signatories to, have a think, have a guess. Let's have the answer. The Antarctic Treaty. Okay, so signed in 1959. There weren't 52 nations signing up in 1959, but as of 2021, we have 52 nations who have backed the Antarctic Treaty, now the Antarctic Treaty System. Next question, please. Which Asian nation has continued whaling in Antarctic waters? So which Asian nation has continued whaling in Antarctic waters? And that's even after moratoriums on whaling. Okay, thank you to those people having a go in the chat window, but let's have the answer. Okay, so the answer is Japan. It's not the only country that's continued to whale in Antarctic waters, but it is a country that has been quite controversial in terms of the number of whales it's taking for, in quotes, scientific purposes. Next question, please. Over what period did whalers nearly drive 4 whale species to extinction? And this is broadening it right out to thinking about when lots of countries were involved in whaling in the Southern Ocean. So over what period did whalers nearly drive 4 whale species to extinction? So this is prior to bans, etc. Let's have the answer. So it was across the 1900s, and that was why by 1982 there was enough of a concern to bring about the international whaling moratorium, which came into force in 1986. Next question, please. How many visitors does Antarctica receive a year? So this is thinking approximately and thinking about tourists. So if you're playing at home, have a go in the chat window. If you're playing on catch up, think about what that figure is. And the answer is up to 50,000. So up to 50,000 annual visitors to Antarctica. And the question is, what impact are they having? How many of them actually land on the continent? Because some of them are just traveling in ships and may not actually land on the continent. But those that do, what have they got on their boots? And what are the other impacts that they are having? Next question, please. How thick are the continent's ice sheets in some places? Now, clearly this answer will vary a little bit, but up to how thick are Antarctica's ice sheets? Why don't you have a guess on this one? Great. Yeah, well, that's possible. Let's have a look let's find out what the right answer is. Okay, 4 kilometers thick, so up to 4 kilometers thick, these ice sheets in some places, so considerable. And final question, we can just about see this image now. What is the producer at the base of the Antarctic food chain? So thinking about that important environment, what is right at the base? What is the producer right at the base of the Antarctic food chain, which of course includes whales and penguins, for example? Do we know this one? Okay, John, let's have the answer, please. And the answer is phytoplankton. Thank you very much. And let's just see that whole picture then, please. Okay, what do you think the image behind the grid is? Sort of iconic. You may have remembered it when it made the news from a few years ago. But let's see what the answer is. Okay, so it's the Larsen C ice sheet shelf breaking up, and this photograph was taken in 2017. Famously, there was a large chunk that broke off and created an iceberg which was tracked for some months. Thank you. Oh, and just a reminder with that terrible klaxon sound that if you are doing the AQA specification, clearly the global common you're studying is Antarctica, which is why we're talking about it this evening. But it's useful to know the specifics of one or more international government organizations, so what they have done, what they haven't done, and the successes, which is what we're trying to concentrate on tonight. So I've just focused there on the International Whaling Commission. But also, you need to know about the role of NGOs, non-governmental organisations, and think about what has been their role in the developing governance of Antarctica. I often think that the right one to go for here is ASOC, or the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, because it's a coalition of a number of different NGOs, including the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, and Greenpeace. So you can talk about that coalition and how they're working together, and they are turning up as observers at meetings of the Antarctic Treaty System and their role. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now through the next couple of slides is take you through two questions for which you might think about in terms of exam practice. So the question is this: evaluate the role of one or more international government organizations in the developing governance of Antarctica. So let's start to break the question down. First of all, we have the command word. So those of you who are familiar with the technique BUG, which is box the command word, underline the key terms, we started with that and we're thinking, what does evaluate mean? And we'll come back to this in a second. So just start thinking already. You might want to, at this point, pause the video, write this question down, and we can work together to annotate the question and sort of pre-plan it. Then we're going to think about what to underline. So I guess the most obvious thing to underline here is international government organizations. You might start annotating which organizations of all of the ones out there you're most comfortable on. So for example, maybe the International Whaling Commission, you want to make a good point about how in some ways they are effective at enhancing the protection of Antarctica, but in some other ways, as proved by Japan continuing whaling, they are less effective. Let's keep going. And again, this is a really important part of the question. Remember that questions sometimes have these sort of directions where they tell you the number that you need to focus on. Here, it's one or more international government organizations. So just one is fine. If you want to do more, if you feel the need to, that'd be fine, but one would be fine. Although you might think that to sustain a whole 20 marker, you might need more than one. The instruction says one or more, so one should be fine. And then on the final slide, I'll show you what the definition of evaluate is. So it's consider several options, ideas, or arguments and come to a conclusion about their importance, success, worth, etc. So, for this question, we're evaluating the success of whichever, either one or two or perhaps three international government organizations in terms of protecting Antarctica and making sure that it stays as pristine as it is. And what I think you should do, although it's not written in the question, and remember, there is some guidance in questions, but ultimately questions are a test of your knowledge and understanding, so they can't give everything away, right? I often get students to think about as much as what is said in the question as also what isn't said. So they've not referred to purpose, scope, and systems for inspection enforcement, but your own knowledge will bring that to the fore, and that's something to suggest as well. I think we have another question to look at, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, this one, there's a lot less annotations, just this slide for this one. Slightly similar, but this time it's got a quote. So international organizations, more so than non-governmental organizations, are the key to enhancing the protection of Antarctica. With reference to IGOs and NGOs, critically assess the extent to which you agree with this statement. So obviously it's a pretty out there statement, it's very provocative, and it's like that on purpose. You'll find most of the statements on 20 markers are very one-sided, and therefore that opens it up for you as a student to take it whichever way you want. So you might want to have a go at a question like that in your own time, perhaps present it to your teacher, or at least try and plan it out and see where you would take it.
Thank you. And I thought we were just going to chuck in a bit of exam gold here. It's worth remembering that because the AQA spec lists 6 threats to Antarctica, which we've been through today, you've got to think this strongly suggests that you're going to be asked to think about what's the most significant, what's probably having the worst impact over perhaps a global scale, on at a local scale, perhaps. What's happening, what's more dramatic, perhaps in the short term, in the long term, what's more easy to manage. So you're being asked to think about those threats, but also compare them to rank them in different ways. So do prepare for that sort of question. Secondly, you can expect to have this idea of international government organisations pitted against NGOs, and we've just seen that in the last question. So thinking about top down versus bottom up, can you manage things from a sort of UN level, from an Antarctic treaty system level, or is it the work that Greenpeace is doing on the ground locally to put pressure on individual nations actually that's making the difference? So prepare for this sort of debate, because that's kind of going to be typical of a 20 marker or a longer question also. Great.
Yeah.
I was just going to say we had some additional resources here, John, as well on the topic. I don't know whether you've got that slide.
Apologies.
There we are. Yeah. No, I was just going to say, if you are still stuck on this topic or want a bit more support on this overall topic of global systems and global governance, do have a look at the Tutor2You website, because in fact, exactly this team, we did the revision blast earlier on in the year, looking at global governance as a whole topic. We've also got a multi-choice quiz there, all about Antarctica as a global common for you to play. And there's also a new revision guide, hot off the presses, all about this topic.
That was
Sorry about that.
No, that's a really important slide.
Yeah.
Alice, apologies for me coming in a little bit quickly there. Fantastic. As always, anybody watching these on a regular basis, I know I find these things really fascinating. And that one, really brings things home. I did think it was kind of ironic that one of the organisations that are trying to keep the Antarctica pristine is called SCAR. I thought that was quite ironic. Do either of you guys know, is all whaling banned? Is whaling completely illegal?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, it is. But what's difficult is when countries try to sort of skirt the line and say that it's for scientific purposes, or as Norway does. Norway, obviously, and it's for no one to question, but claims that it's part of its culture, and so therefore thinks that it's got a sort of right to do it. So it's a very contentious thing. Yes, on paper it's banned, but some countries are not listening to it. And that's ultimately the problem with global governance. We can't go around telling countries what to do. There's no global police.
Yes. And I've heard that in terms of some of the issues around it. It's there's cultural issues there, as well as trying to just make money from whaling in itself. Wonderful. Really good stuff. Thanks to both Abdurrahman and to Alice for that. So that you're aware, the PowerPoint slides are available almost immediately. As soon as we've finished this little broadcast, the slides will be available for you to download. And of course, a video of what we've just been looking at will also be available for you to look through and go through again. I think we're on again next Tuesday, though, aren't we, Alice? We've got another session next Tuesday.
We are, absolutely. We're going to be looking at place and thinking about the changing place topic, but also specifically honing in on place meaning and thinking about how places mean different things to different people depending on their attachment and how that's developed. And then also how places are represented differently, how some representations, perhaps the more informal ones, the more artistic ones, contrast with formal representations, thinking about kind of maps and charts.
Brilliant. So I'll look forward to that, as I'm sure everybody who's watching this will do the same. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Big thanks to everybody who's taken part as well. Some of those answers were really good and we really appreciated them. And we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Good evening, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.